Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm one of the programming librarians at the Cary Library. I'm so excited to be here with Susan Napier talking about Hayao Miyazaki. I didn't know much about him until I started this program, and now I'm learning that people are just such huge fans. So I'm looking forward to learning with you. But before we get to that, I just have a couple of things. I have enabled captions in this program, so you'll see them scrolling along the bottom of your screen. If you don't want them, there's a button down at the bottom. This is live transcript with a little arrow next to it. You can hide the subtitles from there. Um, I always like to thank the Cary Library Foundation for supporting all of our adult programming. Without the foundation and your donations to the foundation, we wouldn't be able to do programs like this. I would also like to thank JPlex, which is the Japanese support group of Lexington, which has partnered with us on this program. So you can buy Susan's books signed and personalized through Bank Square Books, and I will be putting the link. Oh, look at that in the chat as we head into this program. Oh my gosh, there's French.
French, yeah.
That's right. So you can also get it in English.
Yeah.
And you can actually buy any of Susan's books through Bank Square Books in the link I send you. You can put questions in the Q&A anytime during the program. We will take them after Susan's presentation. You can use the chat for comments like Maddie's about her hat. And for any tech issues, we'll be paying attention to that. So without further ado, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Susan and then she can tell you more about herself. She's here to talk about the world of Hayao Miyazaki, the master of Japanese animation. And Susan is a okay, professor of rhetoric and professor of Japanese studies at Tufts University. She teaches courses on Japanese culture, including a seminar on Miyazaki and also on comparative film and literature, including a course on the cinema of apocalypse and one on fantasy and world culture. In the early 1990s, Susan became interested in comics and animation in general, and in Japanese manga and animation in particular. She's now considered one of the leading authorities on Japanese animation in the world. And although that's really exciting and interesting and amazing, I also have to tell you that I learned about Susan through Catherine Lasky, who did a program with Cary Lecture Series a few months ago. And Catherine said, I was having dinner with Susan Napier, Neil Gaiman, and Gregory Maguire, and would you like to meet any of them? And I was like, absolutely. So Susan, of course, stepped forward to do this wonderful program. So again, without further ado, I'm going to hand it to Susan, and she's going to tell us all about Hayao Miyazaki.
Thank you very much, Mina. That was a lovely introduction. And thank you all for coming. And of course, thank the Cary Library. I'm extremely grateful to them. It's very nice to be here. It's particularly nice to be in this kind of situation this year of all years. It's been a somewhat meager year for social interaction, and to have a chance to be in this kind of meeting and the chance to later on have exchanges in the Q&A with people whom I know must be nice and interesting, because they wouldn't be interested in Miyazaki if they were not nice and interesting, is a great pleasure. But I also want to mention a very specific pleasure that I have tonight, which is having a chance to give a talk more or less at or in the purview of a library. I'm embarrassed to say this is the first time I've ever given a talk in a library setting. And that's really, it is embarrassing, because libraries were just so important to me growing up. I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I can't imagine how many hours I spent devouring books I got from the Cambridge Library. And basically, I don't think I would have made it through the less than great conditions of middle school if it hadn't been for the library. So I want to dedicate this talk to the library and to all libraries, and also to all librarians. And I also want to talk a little bit tonight about something which I usually don't spend as much time as I'd like on, which is Miyazaki's literary influences, because Miyazaki also loved libraries and loved reading as a child. And books and reading were an incredibly important part of the influences and inspirations that ultimately created Miyazakiworld. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Let's hope that works. Yes, looking good. Let me know if it's not.
Looks good to me.
Excellent. I'm so glad. So I thought I'd begin not with a quotation from Miyazaki, but a quotation from another fantasist and science fiction person, another what I call world builder, and that's Ursula K Le Guin. And I like the quotation. I think it is very, very relevant to 2021. And so, oops, here we go. Okay, Ursula K. Le Guin. We who hobnob with hobbits and tell tall tales about little green men are quite used to dismissal as mere entertainers or sternly disapproved of as escapists. But I think that the categories are changing like the times. Sophisticated readers are accepting the fact that an improbable and unmanageable world is going to produce an improbable and hypothetical art. At this point, realism is perhaps the least adequate means of understanding or portraying the incredible realities of our existence. So today I'm going to be talking about Miyazaki in the way he portrays the incredible realities of our existence. And it's interesting, I'm talking about a fantasist, a man who creates other worlds, but at the same time, there is a bedrock of the real that is one reason in his work, that is one reason why they are so appealing to all of us. So I'm going to start with a few examples of Miyazaki's incredible realities. Many of you probably are familiar with this creature on the left. His name is Totoro. And as you may have seen earlier, I have a number of Totoros here tonight to enjoy the show with us. And Totoro, on the one hand, seems like a serious fantasy. It's about these children who meet this large woodland creature in a forest near their new home. And he is indeed quite fantastic. He can fly. He can rescue lost children. He can help plants grow really, really fast. So pretty kind of your really all-around fantasy creature. But Totoro is also a story. The movie itself is a story that's very much based on a real and credible and believable situation, which is the story of these young girls, these two sisters who are sent out to the countryside with their father. Their mother is very sick, and they are going to a new house that will make them, allow them to be closer to see their mom. And the first 30, 40 minutes of the film, we don't even meet Totoro, but we do meet a very realistically created world in which you see two young girls trying to learn about their new home, make friends, go to a new school, and maybe they're a little lonely, and maybe they're a little sad. And Totoro comes in to kind of create a special bond with them that helps them deal with these very realistic and difficult things. In the second picture I have there, that is probably many of you will recognize it. It's from Spirited Away, probably Miyazaki's most famous film. It won an Academy Award in 2003. And in this film, the fantasy action comes pretty fast. It's about a little girl who is traveling with her parents. Again, they're going on to a new home, and they take a shortcut and they end up in a very strange and fantastic world. And the world is beautifully realized, and it's a great fantasy creation. But at the same time, there's a core of reality here. The little girl, her name is Chihiro, is just a regular, slightly bratty little kid, actually. She doesn't want to be moving. She doesn't want to go to her new school. She's bored with everything. And she's a little awkward and gangly, as you can kind of see. She's as she tries to navigate around this new world. And all of that is very real. And Miyazaki was trying to actually send a message to children like Chihiro, these young people, about, how you deal with life when it's, not what you want. And what happens is she plunges into a whole fantastic world, which is also, again, kind of based on her own dreams and nightmares, and allows her to learn to be a stronger, much more kind of tougher person as a result of her navigating through this fantasy world. And we can hope that when she comes back to the real world, she will be able to be a stronger and tougher person from then on. So another thing that Miyazaki does is he creates from the reality. He also goes into worlds that are very close to reality, in the case of Kiki's Delivery Service, and in the case of Princess Mononoke, very far from reality. Kiki's Delivery Service is about a young witch who has to go away for a year and learn to take care of herself on her own. And she goes into this beautiful city, which is very much like a bunch of European cities put together: Stockholm, Nice, a place called Visby in Sweden. And it's beautifully realized. It's very believable, and it's a wonderful world in which we get to see this young girl who is a witch trying to learn to make her life there. And Princess Mononoke is very different. This is a movie set in 14th century Japan. It's about a war between beasts and spirits, again, forest spirits and humans. And Miyazaki creates this incredible, fantastic world of the forests, the mountains, and these strange and wonderful creatures. And speaking of wonderful creatures, I also want to mention Miyazaki's incredible characters. They are another big reason why we find Miyazaki so appealing. And I do particularly want to give a shout out to his female characters. This is really rare in 1980s film in any country, and certainly in Japan. Miyazaki makes a point of having interesting, strong, smart female characters. This person here is Dora, or Dola. She is a pirate, in case you weren't aware of that. She's also the mother of a pirate gang, and she's tough and rough and rowdy, but she's also kind of nice and willing to help people out, especially orphans. And she's an amazing character, and probably to some extent based on Miyazaki's own mother, who was a very strong-willed woman, although she was sick much of his childhood, but was smart and capable, and really had a very intense personality. The character on my right is my favorite of all Miyazaki's characters, and she is another early character that he made in both manga, comic form, and in a movie, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. And she is really exceptional. Again, this is 1984, long before Katniss Everdeen of the Hunger Games was around. She is a warrior. She's a scientist. She has telepathic powers. She is able to bond with people and with other creatures. And she is actually able to save the world. All this in a movie that was made, gosh, what is it, 40 years ago, that still seems incredibly relevant. Okay, incredible characters continued. Of course, one of Miyazaki's best abilities is his ability to make fantastic characters. And again, I want to mention the Totoros. I mentioned the term fuzzy illusion. One of my colleagues, Michael Dillon Foster, brought this up in terms of Miyazaki. When I first heard it, I thought, oh, how cute, fuzzy illusion. Yes, they are fuzzy. Very fuzzy. But no, actually what Professor Foster was talking about is vague illusions, i.e., in other words, Miyazaki is not kind of taking a character from Japanese tradition or the Japanese past or history. He's making up a character who contains many different aspects to it. If you look at Totoro, I mean, what do you think? What does he look like? I mean, he looks like a lot of different creatures, right? He looks like a cat with whiskers. He could be an owl with those strange kind of feathery things on his stomach. He's also, he's got ears. It could be a little bit like a fox. So he is full of different illusions. And that's one of the things that makes Miyazaki's world so interesting, is that Miyazaki doesn't just copy things. He takes things and then he kind of puts them together and creates his own vision of things. A slightly different version of this is the Soot Sprites, who, again, if you've seen My Neighbor Totoro, these are these fuzzy creatures that Mei and Satsuki, the two young sisters, see when they first move into their new house. And I love the Soot Sprites, partly because they're very cute and they can only be seen by children. But also, I think they really are very good as a kind of way of talking about anxieties and fears. Because if you think about it, here are these two sisters and they've moved to a new house. It's all very exciting. And, they've never lived in the country before. And wow, it's all going to be great. And they're turning cartwheels and everything. But, it's still a little scary. There's still some worries kind of swirling around there. And to me, the sprites are just great animated fuzzy visions of what it's like to have these pesky little worries and fears kind of rolling around in us, even when we're trying so hard to be brave and deal with our new world. So this is a kind of way in which I think Miyazaki's imagination is so extraordinary. And of course, Totoro himself, as I said, is another kind of a way to, you could look at him as an imaginary friend who comes along at just the right moment. And again, it's something that we know about, people do use their imagination for comfort, but Miyazaki makes Totoro into a real and very believable figure. Okay, so how do we bring all these aspects of Miyazaki together? It's almost like trying to catch a shooting star. And this is from Howl's Moving Castle, where his protagonist does in fact catch a shooting star. And Miyazaki had always wanted to do a scene in which a character catches a shooting star ever since he was a young man in college. And I thought, how wonderful to be a great animator and to be able to, 40 years later, create that scene that you've always dreamed of doing. But I also think it's very much what Miyazaki is. He is a kind of shooting star, shooting out sparks everywhere and burning with so many interesting and wonderful intensities. So where does this all come from? I'd like to talk about this sort of throughout the rest of the talk and give you a feeling of the many things that have inspired and influenced Miyazaki that I spent 8 years working on to create my book, which I called Miyazakiworld. And I call it The Pleasures of Communication because it gave me a chance to communicate to the rest of the world some of the interesting things that I found out about Miyazaki. And if you'll allow me to brag for one minute only, and then I promise I'll stop. As of 2 weeks ago, the book has been translated or is going to be translated into 10 languages. I've mentioned there's a French one, Le Monde de Miyazaki, and Miyazakiworld in Japanese, but there's also Chinese, Korean, Arabic, Russian, Ukrainian, Czech, Spanish, Italian, and French. I think that's it.
Hooray! That's what we said in the chat.
That is something. And by the way, well, I'll stop bragging for a moment and point out that it's not me and how fascinating I am. It's because Miyazaki is so fascinating that around the world, from the Ukraine to Korea, and Vietnamese too, people love his work and they want to find out more about him. So how do you write a biography of a living person? This was interesting. I would suggest you do it very carefully, very, very carefully, especially of a Japanese living person. Japan is a country in which people really treasure their privacy. Miyazaki is also virtually a national treasure. He is beloved. He is someone who sort of is beyond, human at this point. So you have to be careful. I mean, even I find that when I teach my Miyazaki seminar at Tufts, and I had a student who once said, "Oh, I think Miyazaki is just like Santa Claus." I said, well, yes. I mean, they both control very important businesses where they're kind of hands-on and they create wonderful things and they have a staff of wonderful entities to help them. But, it's tough. It's probably tough to be Santa Claus too. So one of the things I had to deal with when I was working on this was, of course, Studio Ghibli, who are the people who, first of all, it's a studio that Miyazaki founded with his colleague Takahata, the late Takahata Isao, unfortunately. And Ghibli is still very much alive and well. At one point, it looked like it was going to kind of bite the dust, but it came back. And Miyazaki is now working on his next film. And the person who's been particularly kind of behind the scenes at Studio Ghibli is a man named Toshio Suzuki, who's been the producer since really very early on in Miyazaki's output. And I never got to meet Suzuki-san, but I did get to read a lot of his books because he loves to write about Miyazaki and tell all kinds of anecdotes, some of them very amusing about him. And this is one book, it's called Being Blown by the Wind. And the wind is a very important meaning, as important meaning in Ghibli, because Ghibli itself is named for a hot wind off the Sahara, and they wanted to blow a new wind into Japanese animation. So I read a lot of books by Toshio Suzuki, and I did also get to interview Miyazaki himself several times. But what I found particularly helpful was reading interviews with other kinds of people. This man is Yoichi Shibuya. He's a rock critic, and you wouldn't think a rock critic and a animator would necessarily have a lot in common, but actually they have great conversations. They're very relaxed with each other. Shibuya is pretty famous, so he's not afraid of Miyazaki's fame, which can happen with other interviewers who are like, oh, mustn't say anything. And so Shibuya is his two books of interviews with Miyazaki gave me all kinds of anecdotes and interesting information. They were in Japanese, and having to translate very colloquial, sometimes slangy Japanese was an interesting experience. I'll be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if you like. Another set of interviews I found really interesting was with a woman named Tokiko Kato, who is a singer. And she's probably about Miyazaki's age, and they kind of come from the same generation of anti-war, kind of radical people. She's married to a very strong left-wing leader in the 60s. And again, their conversation was very relaxed and brought up all kinds of things. Miyazaki had come from a rather wealthy family. He felt a lot of guilt about this. He was very lucky, he was very privileged. And he and Tokiko Kato really talk about this a lot. I also might mention, if you've seen this wonderful film by Miyazaki, which is in a way a kind of dealing with some of the issues of the 1960s and issues of war and guilt, that Tokiko Kato actually plays the beautiful singer Gina in Porco Rosso. So other parts of power and control that I had to deal with and were often very helpful were the staff. Studio Ghibli is not huge, it's not remotely like Disney, but it's for a Japanese studio, it's quite large. And when I started going to Japan and doing interviews, it was just when Ghibli had been disbanded for a little while. And I got to talk to a number of people who'd worked with Miyazaki and were sort of summing up what it had been like. So that was also very interesting. I heard some interesting stories. And I should also mention that a number of women in the staff were very helpful to me. And Miyazaki is very much his kind of a director who has puts an enormous amount of his own stamp onto things. These women were also very, very important in helping him realize his vision. And without them, I don't think they would have nearly as beautiful works as he has produced. So now you know why I care about Miyazaki. Why should you care about Miyazaki? Well, there's the bottom line. Ghibli makes money. They're nothing close to Disney, but as I said, they're internationally known. They're becoming increasingly popular as the years go by. It's been very interesting watching the amount of money that each of the Ghibli films makes. Particularly Miyazaki's films have made more and more money every time they've come out. So this is a global economic financial force to be reckoned with. Also, of course, cute gifts. I was telling Mina that at the beginning of this, that originally Ghibli had not wanted to go what they thought of as the Disney route and, create plushies and sort of special merch that you can get. But eventually they kind of gave in. I do think that Totoro was so cute that they kind of had to make a Totoro doll. And once they did that, it was, the floodgates were open for more and more cute things. Potential video game crossover. Very slowly and carefully, Ghibli has gotten into making video games. This is Ni no Kuni, which is actually quite a beautiful game, and it's not done by Miyazaki, but it retains a lot of Miyazaki's values, and we'll talk about those values later on. Also, soon to be a theme park. I checked just recently, it's still on board for opening in 2022. I am sure that will be quite an experience. Again, Ghibli had always said they wouldn't do anything like this, but I think sort of pressure from the public and again, just probably the chance just to do something cool and exciting like a theme park. And they say it's going to be very different from Disneyland. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing it. So really, why should you be interested in Miyazaki? Well, in general, Miyazaki's work and anime, Japanese animation in general, are very interesting to people like me who work on pop culture because they are an alternative to American popular culture. And this sounds obvious. I mean, these are very Japanese, lots of Japanese references, lots of Japanese stories. But it's actually quite amazing. When I first started getting into Japanese animation, which is the late 80s, there was really no interest in America, in other cultures, except maybe during the 1960s and the British invasion. But anime, through word of mouth, started getting more and more popular from the 1980s to the 1990s and then to the 21st century, where, as you know, you can go into a bookstore, if you could go into a bookstore, and see all these manga and anime related titles. And it's really exciting to me because I've been working on Japanese culture all my life, and I wanted to have people be interested in Japan, just generally other cultures, and to see this really strong encroachment and just genuine excitement on part of Americans for a very different culture from their own. In fact, how different? Well, a few years ago, I wrote a book in which I interviewed a lot of anime fans about why they liked anime, and not just Miyazaki, but anime in general. And they had some very interesting things to say. Among them, they mentioned that, well, sometimes the good guys lose, which, really up until pretty recently was very unusual in American, in Hollywood with cinema. You would have a happily ever after kind of ending. And this started to change. And I think anime has been an influence. One of my friends and colleagues, Roland Keltz, and I have speculated that after 9/11, young Americans started realizing that sometimes you do lose, sometimes bad things happen and they don't necessarily get better, or they become more complicated. And Japanese animation showed characters dealing with complicated situations that were often dark and that couldn't be resolved by a magic twist. So this is, I think, one reason why anime became more and more popular in the early 21st century. Also, as another person mentioned, I thought this is a very interesting quotation, characters are more real than in Hollywood films. And you think about it, we're talking about animated characters, right? But these people felt that Japanese anime actually really went into psychological depth. They really talked about people as they really are, not superheroes, but just people who may or may not have magical elements to them. This is Kiki, I mentioned before, the young witch. Kiki's really one magical ability is to ride a broomstick. Oh, and also to talk to her cat Gigi, whom she is currently talking to right now in this slide. But aside from these two things, Kiki is very real. And as I mentioned, she has to go to this new city all by herself and learn to take care of herself on her own, learn to make friends, learn to create a job. She eventually has a delivery service where she goes on her broomstick and takes things to people, and gets scared and lonely and depressed. And in this very, very touching movie, which is, yes, it's about a young witch, but it's not the witch you're expecting. It's a witch who's very, very human. Okay, another thing that I really have appreciated this year of all years is how Miyazaki's films, and Ghibli films in particular, in general, are really trying to send us a message of resilience, of being able to kind of deal with the challenges that are so many and so complicated and so intense in today's world. And Miyazaki does this in various ways. In Ponyo, a fairly recent movie that this slide is from, we see two children dealing with a tsunami, a gigantic wave that has taken over their whole town. Their parents seem to be lost. It's and could be absolutely terrifying. But they find, and this is a fantasy, in this tsunami, in this water that the wave has brought out, all these amazing things. They find fish from 20 million years ago. They find, they magic up a little toy boat till it's big enough for them to kind of tootle around in, and they go crossing the water and looking at these wonderful fish. And it's an amazing example of very young children just kind of rising to this strange and weird world that they're suddenly in. So sometimes it can be as big as a tsunami, and sometimes it can be as small as a Totoro. Well, I said Totoro's not that small, but as small as a situation of a Totoro in the rain. As I said earlier, Totoro is about two little sisters who are dealing with a lot of things, their mother's sickness, a new home. And in their meeting with Totoro, this is the first time the older sister, Mei, gets to meet him, they become friends, they bond, and actually Satsuki, the older sister, even gives Totoro an umbrella, which is he's very pleased with. And it's a way of showing how to make friends, how to deal with a rainy night when you're waiting for your father to come home on the bus and he's not coming. And Totoro loves the umbrella. And it's a nice symbol of friendship and, again, rising up to sort of sad or scary moments. So I do want to talk a little bit about what I consider the very rich influences that Miyazaki gets from literature. I was telling Mina this, that one reason I'm so happy to be doing this talk at a library is that Miyazaki said really loves books, really loves books. His older brother Arata said, when I got extra money, I would buy food. Miyazaki would buy books. And he did, and he read them avidly throughout his life. And this picture here is actually a book cover from a very small book I bought years ago at a library in Shikoku in Japan. It was a library that was having an exhibition of covers of the 50 books that Miyazaki most loved, particularly from childhood. And next to the covers were handwritten notes by Miyazaki about why he liked the book. And I was able to buy this little book, and I can tell you, it's one of my most prized possessions. I'm so pleased with it. I look in it and I say, "Ooh, is that what he thought about The Hobbit?" Or, "Oh, that's why he loves The Secret Garden so much." And what is very interesting, again, I'm kind of pushing this fact that we are also internationally connected now. Most of the books that Miyazaki loves are European children's literature. So these include Alice in Wonderland. And of course, Alice is a young girl who falls into a very strange world and a very imaginative world. And Heidi, which is, I think it's a German book, but it's set in the Swiss Alps about a young girl who, this is not a fantasy, but it's about a young girl, again, dealing with being an orphan, going to a new place, in this case, a mountain village in the Alps, and learning to make friends and take care of goats, as you see. Robinson Crusoe, this is an adventure story. The other two works did feature young girls, and Miyazaki does have a lot of wonderful, interesting young girl characters. Totoro and Kiki being the two obvious movies. But he also loves adventure books, and he's created many adventure movies. I mentioned the one of the pirates with La Puta. But I should say that he doesn't uncritically accept all these books. In fact, he has a very interesting comment on this one. He says of Robinson Crusoe, "This is a thrilling book, but when I read it as an adult, something bothered me. If the hero had not had a gun, he would have been in serious trouble. The white people who read this book rampage through the world, always with their guns, plundering treasure from other islands and countries and shooting people. I don't have a gun, nor do I have any desire for one." So it's a fun book, but a little disturbing nonetheless. So all of these books and reading helped create Miyazaki's kind of inspired his own very fertile imagination to create works that are not usually based on any other books, but are kind of inspired and fed by all the things he's read. Spirited Away is, as I said, a movie about a young girl going into a strange world. there are definite aspects of Alice in Wonderland there, but there's so much that is purely and fantastically Miyazaki. So I'm not going to spend too much time on Miyazaki's history, but I think you should know a little bit about where he's coming from in his own life. I use the word traumatic, and I think it's true because he really has grown up during some very difficult times in world history and in Japanese history. And so very quickly, he was born in 1941. That's the year that World War II began. And he was almost 4 years old. He was 4 years old during the last year of the war when American planes came to bomb the mainland of Japan. And they bombed, in particular, in a spring evening, lots of parts of Tokyo and the surrounding areas, to the point where, as Miyazaki says, I remember the bombings. Remember, he's 4 years old. He says, I see my street on fire. And that's the kind of things that he was growing up with as a very little boy. And these memories of his streets on fire, trying to escape through the fire, is very, very much part of his life. He also had to deal with, on a personal level, the fact that his mother was sick. She had tuberculosis, which was almost always a deadly disease back then. In fact, she did recover, which is wonderful. But for 9 years, she was pretty much bedridden. So that is a very strange and difficult situation to be a young boy growing up with. His father did his best, but they were basically 4 boys trying to deal with, kind of learning how to live really without their mother's help. Just mentioning this for political aspects, Miyazaki was part of the 1960s. During the 60s, Japan was rocked by all kinds of demonstrations about something called the US-Japan Security Treaty. And Miyazaki has sort of grown, has come by a fairly strong sort of left-wing attitude about life. And one example is in his lesser known but really amazing movie Porco Rosso, which is about a former World War I airplane pilot who is so disgusted by the war and what human beings do to each other that he grows the face of a pig. His friends, he's Italian, want him to come back to help fight the next war under Mussolini, who's a fascist. And in this great scene where his Italian airman friend is trying to convince him, Porco Rosso says, better a pig than a fascist. So we can see sometimes Miyazaki is trying to put some political messages across. He's also very concerned with what's going on in the world around him in terms of how people live. And he was very affected by the so-called bubble period in Japan. And the bubble period was basically a real estate bubble that grew bigger and bigger and bigger, and people made lots and lots of more money until it burst. And there is still a lot of unresolved problems from that period. There was definitely a kind of turn in Japan away from tradition into more consumption and high living and material goods that Miyazaki does satirize very gently in some of his movies, including in Kiki's Delivery Service, where Kiki, the young witch, she can't afford to have fun and buy, fancy clothes and nice shoes and cars and everything. So she's looking at these people who are having a pretty nice life and is kind of envious, but at the same time, she does what she has to do. She goes back and keeps working. Another thing that came out of the bubble period was what I call the concretization of Japan. In other words, to spend their way out of the bubble, the Japanese government decided to just spend lots of money on road building and on creating dams and really destroying a lot of Japanese natural beauty. And Miyazaki and many other people were very concerned about this. And again, being Miyazaki, he could create a protest that was fantastic and memorable and beautiful and very different. And this comes through particularly in Spirited Away, where we have a river spirit who actually first appears as a stink spirit. He smells abominably. Everyone's going, what are we going to do? And then he goes to a bathhouse for the gods, and he is washed and cleaned. And it turns out he's not a stink spirit. He's actually a river god who's been so polluted by everything, all the muck and stuff that has gone into his river, that he's become a stink spirit, but he really isn't. and he becomes cleaned, and he's very, very happy and free after this. But as Miyazaki says, even our rivers are suffering. And being able to do great animation and being a great fantasy world creator, he's able to create a vision of suffering river that I think is very, very memorable, and really more memorable than if he just talked about dirty rivers. He also deals with issues such as the graying of Japan. Japan is maybe one of the demographically oldest countries in the world right now. And Miyazaki deals with this in a couple of movies. This is from Howl's Moving Castle, one of the few works that he does base on another work of literature, of children's literature, Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones, who's an English fantasy writer. But being Miyazaki, he really plays around a lot with the plot, but he does keep the idea of a young girl being transformed by magic spell into being an old woman. And what's really lovely about this movie is we see her becoming freer and more liberated and tougher and more interesting as she becomes this old woman. So just wanted to mention again the idea of gender as being something that is something that Miyazaki is very happy to kind of highlight, and not just what is typical in a lot of movies, anime, young women, but also old women as well. So I wanted to conclude with a question about whether Miyazaki's work can serve as an alternative to Disney. And I'm not saying that I dislike Disney. I think there's some really fascinating Disney movies. I actually thought Frozen was really quite an amazing movie, particularly Frozen 2, actually. But I do like the idea, especially in a time where American corporations do get bigger and stronger and Disney gets bigger and stronger, that there will be other alternatives to Disney, not just in terms of watching things, but in terms of what they're watching, because Miyazaki's world is a very different worldview than that of Disney. And just a very simple example, in his movie Princess Mononoke that I mentioned, that's set in the 14th century and has gods and beasts warring against humans, we have a really different view of nature, nature as something that is worthy, that is really different from us, that is really, that needs to be respected and dealt with. And it's quite different from the very, very sweet and touching view of Bambi in Disney. And this, I think, for gender and for nature in particular, and the environment, Disney and Miyazaki do create very, very different worldviews. I'm actually going to be exploring that next year when I'm teaching a seminar, a course on Disney versus Ghibli. I think I'm calling it Ghibli, or maybe Disley, Ghibli or Disley. And so finally, I hope by now I've kind of given you an idea why I think Miyazaki is important, but I wanted to return to literature for my last quotation, because I think that literature and art are all the more important after the year we've been having. I think we've thought a lot about power in terms of power of nature, power of a virus, powers of countries, powers of politicians. But I do believe that the arts have a very important power as well, and that we really mustn't neglect it. So I'm just going to end with this quotation from Stefan Helgeson. Insofar as literature, and I would say art in general, is a globally transportable but also changeable institution, it cannot be understood exclusively in terms of political power and domination, but also as an enabling alternative to other domains of power. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you, and look forward to any questions you would like to pose to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was amazing. I feel like I've learned a tremendous amount. Do you want to turn your share screen off and we can just chat?
Yes. Hang on. Oh, right. Sorry. Okay.
Great. Okay. So I was going to keep my camera off, but I had to come back and say there's been a lot of interest in the chat, in the Q&A, about if Miyazaki's going to make another film. Judy said he's 80, which, is the new 60.
Yes, absolutely. And 60 is the new 30. Yeah.
So if you think there's going to be another movie by Miyazaki, then we have some people that are like, I have more questions.
Sure. Well, I check every other week or so about this. As of last time I checked, he is absolutely going to make another movie. It's going slowly. It was going slowly even before the pandemic hit, and I imagine it's much more slowly now. A year ago, it was about 15% done. And so I'm afraid it's going to take a while. But he seems absolutely committed to it. I mean, he actually did retire a few years ago. As I said, that's when I just sort of was going to Japan doing interviews, and he was very adamant, saying, "No, this time I really mean it. Nope, nope, nope. I'm really going to try." He'd actually retired a couple of times before, and people were saying, "Oh yeah, right." He said, "Nope, nope. This is it. I'm going to retire." Right. So you know, he put in a few shorts. He probably sat around the house a bit. Went for walks, and then realized, this is not who I am. I've got to get back to the studio. So he did. And the new film, I'm very curious about it. It's based on a 1930 kind of a young adult novel or children's novel called Kimi Nara Dosuru, I think. If it were you, what would you do? I think is the English translation. And it's about a boy growing up in the city, and again, dealing with sort of issues about his family and just kind of growing up. And it doesn't sound like it's going to be a fantasy. Miyazaki's quote unquote final film was also not a fantasy. It was a movie about an historical personage, Jiro Horikoshi, who created the Mitsubishi Zero plane. But this one is about a child and a boy. And Miyazaki has not done that many male protagonists in quite a while. So that's going to be exciting too. And that's really probably about all I know at this point. I mean, I wait, just, so far, I've not heard anything that says he's not going to do this. So I'm really very relieved and hugely looking forward to it. I imagine he'll be in his mid 80s by the time it comes out. And I think what a wonderful way to spend your 80s, creating something memorable and beautiful.
So I'm going to go back to the other questions before we get back to anybody has additional questions about that. Sayaka asks, do you like Doraemon?
Of course. Yeah, I do. Doraemon. Doraemon is very cute and a kind of very clever series. It's incredibly popular, except I don't think it's been shown in America. So I'm interested where Sayako saw Doraemon. It's a story about a young boy, a little boy actually, who doesn't like doing his homework. And what luck, he is visited by a cat from the future named Doraemon, who helps him with his homework. And they also have all kinds of adventures. And I've heard, I was very interested in this, that it was very popular in Asia and Southeast Asia, where there is this very strong commitment to working hard and doing your homework from early on. And so Doraemon became this sort of cute way of kind of exploring, again, through fantasy and maybe a little bit of science fiction, because he is a cat from the future. Or is he from outer space? Maybe both. Ways about things that, we all kind of don't necessarily want to do every day, like do our homework. But wouldn't it be great if someone like Doraemon could come and help us?
So John asks, the pacing and passage of time in Miyazaki's films contrasts strongly to that of American animated films or Western films in general. This has limited Ghibli's appeal in the West, but appeals to us fans. What can you tell us about its use and techniques? Also, is it common in other Japanese visual media?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is something we do talk about a lot, and when you deal with Miyazaki, but other Japanese works as well. Yes, there is more willingness for silence, even uncomfortable silence, because in American movies, you want that silence filled up fast. Less use of soundtracks, definitely in Ghibli movies. You do have soundtracks and they're beautiful. Miyazaki has been collaborating for just about 40 years with a man named Joe Hisaishi, who's done every single one of his movies since his first one. And but their willingness to have silence is very important. It's really definitely something that did worry people like Disney, because at one point, Ghibli and Disney had an agreement for a number of years in which Disney did distribute a lot of Miyazaki's films, and there were issues around that distribution. It's a very interesting story, because the Disney people said, "Oh yeah, we really like your work," and the Ghibli people said, "Great, and now you're not going to do anything to touch it, right?" And they said, "Oh no, we won't." But then it'd be sort of like, "Well, don't you think for American audiences are not going to like it if you don't have some music here? And don't you think American audiences could use a little bit more dialogue here?" And sometimes to the point of really, I'm still frustrated by Spirited Away, which is one of my absolute favorite movies. And I mentioned at the end, we're not quite sure what's going to happen to this young girl. And that's the idea. We don't know for sure, how much she's retained from her fantasy experience, her experience in this fantasy world. But Disney couldn't stand that. So they actually added some lines of dialogue at the very end of the film to make sure that we knew that everything was going to be okay and that she learned a lot from her experience. And I thought, why can't you trust American kids to say, I think they're going to figure it out? And that's something that really does. I mean, you've touched an old wound here, John. Yes, it really is something that I care about. But it's not just an animation that silence and slowness is used, but also in movies. Particularly famous is Yasujiro Ozu. Ozu is one of the greatest filmmakers of the 20th century. And he is very much, he does films about family and growing up, sometimes with a little bit of comedy and often some tragedy involved, but he will hold a shot a long time, and he won't allow music, he won't allow dialogue. And again, the American viewer can get very antsy, what's going on, but it forces you to kind of become part of this world, to enter into it and to feel with the characters. And he'll also kind of go, and Miyazaki does this too, he'll do what's called a pillow shot. He will train the camera away from the main person to, something else, like a beautiful glass. Pretend this is a beautiful glass, and you won't see the person, but you just see the glass. And it's the idea that you're actually following the point of view of the person watching it. And that person is trying to collect their thoughts, or maybe thinking about memories that the glass has spawned in them. But again, it's not going to give you explanation, and it's not going to be accompanied by a swelling crescendo of music.
Mm-hmm. So actually that brings a question of mine up, which is, why do you think Miyazaki chose anime as his format or vehicle to tell his stories? Because you said he's done other things as well, but why does he always come back to animation?
Well, that's a nice question. No one's ever asked me that. I really like that. I think it is interesting. A little bit, I always do kind of feel like, wow, he was such a reader. Why didn't he write stories? Well, actually, he did. He made manga. But this was unusual in the 1950s. He was, they say, from a rather, upper class family or wealthy family, and most boys his age were, not supposed to be creating manga. It was considered a little bit, not the thing. And but he really, really loved it. He was a very good artist. I think that's maybe the obvious answer. He was a terrific artist. I have a story in my book about how when he was little, he and his older brother Arata had pictures in the school exhibition, and they were hung up, of course, as one does. And Arata, the older brother, recalls seeing two teachers standing in front of Hayao, the younger brother, Miyazaki's work, and saying, "That's too good. I bet his parents helped him." So yeah, he didn't win the prize that time, but he really was good. And he still draws. This is really important. At the age of 80, he's willing to use CGI much more than he used to, but he does an immense amount of hand drawing, and his hands aren't what they used to be, and his eyes aren't what they used to, but he really believes in this very, very strongly. He does not want to approach the world through a computer. But so he actually tried to get work as a manga, what they call a mangaka, a manga writer. And that really didn't pan out. And he got his first job, and what would be his only job, his only job at that time, at Toei Animation Studios. And Toei was one of the top 2 or 3 animation studios in Japan. They had quite a lot of money. They were actually trying to become the Disney of Japan. And Miyazaki started kind of shooting up the ranks really fast. In a way, he kind of never looked back.
Mhm.
He was, even as a new boy, he was making suggestions to the older people, which is very shocking in Japan. You don't
Yeah.
tell your elders what they're doing. And eventually he and Takahata, whom I mentioned, his partner, kind of got into trouble with the studio brass and left with some other couple of people. And ultimately, sort of a few iterations down, they formed their animation studio. But I think, I mean, that is interesting. He does still do manga, and he has some great ones. And I mentioned Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind, which is a brilliant movie. Came out in 1984. It was based on a manga that Miyazaki had begun to draw in 1982, I believe. And then he kind of paused it, made the movie, and then he went back to creating the manga. And 12 years later, after he'd finished from 1982, he finally finished the manga, and it is a masterpiece. If you like Tolkien, if you like kind of the world building of C.S. Lewis or Tolkien, it has that kind of immersive quality. There's an awful lot of dialogue. But a lot of action too. And it's a very interesting, morally complicated, fascinating work. So yeah, I think he has kept his hand in. He also has one children's story that he wrote that illustrated, which is very charming too. And it's actually called Princess Mononoke, but it really doesn't have much to do with the movie. So yeah, he's I think the one sad thing is he should have written a novel. He should have written another The Secret Garden or something. He loves gardens. He has lots of gardens in his movies too.
He sounds like a fascinating person. Daniela asks, she read Miyazakiworld in 2019. Do you think that another creator like Miyazaki will appear again, even as the times change, particularly in the advent of digital art, which was interesting what you had said earlier about how he will allow for CGI and things like that, but he does like, the drawing and the writing is still.
That's such a good question. And it's a sort of painful question. I absolutely believe that there will be other great creators in the animated world. Absolutely. And there are already in Japan and in other places too. Pixar is doing amazing things. Um, I fear that hand drawn. I mean, some people are still doing that. Some people are still even doing stop motion animation, which is a very time intensive kind of animation. But the kind of clout that Ghibli films have had in their hand-drawn way, I do worry if that's going to be appreciated as much as time goes by. Miyazaki is famous for getting annoyed with his younger animators because they won't go outside and look at a caterpillar and draw a caterpillar. They will go inside to their screens and figure out how to do a caterpillar. No, you don't know. That's not how a caterpillar moves. Go out there and look. And that's the thing. I think we are losing the natural world. And sort of a certain kind of reality-based art, which sounds odd for animation, but I really think it's true. I mean, Disney, good heavens, really famously used rotoscoping, and they would actually do to have real ballerinas, real dancers in to kind of move so they could approximate Snow White's movements or Sleeping Beauty's movements, and that may be largely over. But in terms of great artists, I certainly would recommend Hosoda Mamoru, who's a really wonderful and very humane artist. He's done a movie called Wolf Children and a number of other really great movies. And also, particularly a director known as, his name is Makoto Shinkai. And I'm sure that some of you have heard of Shinkai. He did what became the biggest anime hit in the world ever, Your Name,
Mhm.
Kimi no Nawa, in, I think it was 2016. And it is an extraordinary film, and Shinkai is an extraordinary director. He's much younger than Miyazaki, but he's very imaginative, and he creates, again, these immersive, gorgeous worlds. He does use, however, computers basically all the time, and but a very sort of photorealistic scenes that he creates that are almost realer than real and extraordinary. So I do recommend looking at Shinkai. He's not the same as Miyazaki, but there never will be another Miyazaki. But in the meantime, take a look at Your Name if you haven't already.
I will get a list of these resources and names and things from you, Susan, before,
Sure, yeah.
and I'll send it out in the recap, which I send to everybody after the presentation. Tyler asked, and this is a question I had as well, what was your favorite experience meeting Miyazaki?
Wow. Well, the first two times, it was just, he was so delightful. He was so, I think the word is ebullient, just kind of lively, and saying he was genki, very up. And so excited about things. The first time I met him, I was actually at his studio, and I think they had I think they were working on Princess Mononoke, and I was allowed to kind of look at what they were doing, and it was very, very extraordinary seeing everyone, really working away in creating these sketches, these cells. And he is a very talkative, very effervescent guy. And we ended up, turns out that I had lived for a year in the town that Miyazaki still lives in, and where actually Totoro is supposedly takes place. So we had a really nice talk about that. And one thing I really appreciate was the second time I met him, he was getting a medal at a big ceremony. And I think at that point I asked him about Princess Mononoke and this older woman character named Eboshi. She's not that old. She's probably in her 30s. And I said, well, some people think that Eboshi is kind of, cruel and tough, because she's not a cuddly female character at all. And he looked at me and said, well, Eboshi's my favorite character in the whole film. And ooh, I learned something really interesting. And I get it, because again, as I said, his mother was very important to him. His mother was strong-minded, strong-willed, exercised a lot of, kind of personal charisma. And I thought, oh yeah, that's the kind of thing I never would have known if I hadn't just sort of sidled up to him and talked to him. The last meeting was, it was wonderful, but it was also sad. It was right after they had closed down the studio a couple of months, and it was in his atelier, which is next to his personal kind of studio, next to the main studio. And I did feel like he was more thoughtful. He still was talkative and interesting, but I felt like he was more thoughtful, and that he was probably sort of thinking back on his life. And I mentioned this in the book, but I asked him, my husband's a portrait painter. So my husband was very interested in finding out what Miyazaki, if he were to have his portrait painted, what would he want to have in the portrait? Because often people bring in things that really mean a lot to them. And so I thought, well, do you want to have, would you have Totoro, or would you have an animation cell or something? And he said, no, I would just have me walking into the shadows. I thought, okay, wow, that's not, for a man who's created one of the most highly colored worlds that ever existed, that's a very interesting thing to say. And who knows, maybe if I asked him now, a couple of years later, it might be very different.
Thank you. That was as we would expect. Dan says, I'm interested in Miyazaki's early career as a manga creator and his transition from manga to anime. I know he did Nausicaa as a manga. What else can, as a manga, what else can you tell us about his manga career?
Well, as I said, he always, he started, I'm trying to remember, he really started as a career in animation, really, by going into at Toei at the age of like 22. And so manga were always a little bit something on the side. In fact, I was always really impressed by this with Nausicaa, which, as I said, is a manga masterpiece. He would come home from working at the studio doing animation, and he would work on the manga from midnight to 4 in the morning. I'm thinking, holy God, how did you do that? But he said it actually, gave him his sort of private time, his creative time, and really was actually really helped him a lot in his in sort of all his careers. Since then, he's continued to draw manga just for fun. I have a couple of them there. They're certainly available in Japan. I don't know if they're available in English. One of them became the basis for the movie I was mentioning, Porco Rosso, about the Italian aviator who takes on the features of a pig. And the manga is really a lot more about aviation. Miyazaki adores planes, and he adores technology, particularly technology that's no longer around. So he loves seaplanes and all kinds of cool gliders, and he likes to create his own sort of planes. And so he loves to do manga in which you see these planes very prominently displayed. And he actually did a manga first, his supposedly final film. The Wind Rises is based on a manga that he had done that originally it was I think this comes out in 14 episodes in a kind of a craft model kind of journal, and it was basically based on this story of this airplane creator Jiro Horikoshi, and then Suzuki Toshio, whom I mentioned before, the producer, who is often kind of behind the scenes doing things, said to me, it's like, why don't you make a movie out of that? I mean, it's like, oh, no, it's very, it's a strange subject. This is a warplane after all. And Suzuki said, no, I think it's maybe time for the Japanese to think about, the war in a different way. And so his manga inspired this really beautiful and wonderful movie too.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go through some kind of quick answer questions so we can get through as many as possible because you have a bunch here. Has his children taken on animation?
Yes, kind of. I don't know much about one of his sons. He has two sons, and Goro Miyazaki is a son who has taken on animation. Goro originally trained as a landscape architect, and then I think over the years there were a number of sort of so-called heir apparents who were supposed to kind of take on be the next generation of Ghibli directors, and somehow they never stayed around. So it was getting on to where it looked like it was just going to be mainly Miyazaki and Takahata, who by this point were in their 60s and 70s. And so I think there was a certain amount of pressure on Goro, the son, to kind of leave landscape architecture and learn how to animate. And he has taken on this mantle of animator. His first movie was from Tales of Earthsea, the Ursula K Le Guin stories, and it wasn't that successful. But I mean, the animation is actually quite beautiful. But he's had at least one, maybe two more movies. I've seen one which are more sort of less fantastical, and a little bit more based on the real world, and they're very beautiful and well done. I have to say I don't find them as appealing as either Takahata's or Miyazaki the father, but he definitely is creating a following, and he has plenty of time to develop in more creative ways.
Mm-hmm. Do you speak Japanese?
I do. I have been learning Japanese since I was in high school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I've lived in Japan 8 years in all, 8.5 years, and I've gone to Japan almost every year since I was 17 for at least a little while. Not this year, obviously, but
yeah. Wow. Do you have a personal favorite film by Miyazaki?
It's always tough. It's I really do love My Neighbor Totoro because it's just a really exquisite film, and it deals with so much so subtly and simply and beautifully. I mean, I just think it's a great film for everyone to see, not just it can be seen by a 5-year-old child, or it can be seen by a 95-year-old grandmother. It's a lot to everybody. The film that I think is most incredible is Spirited Away, because I think he really dug into his unconscious and started just kind of making things up and just really creating a film that you can see it on so many levels. I've just finished yet another article about it. I've written, I think, 3 articles about it. And my dream, this is very pathetic and very nerdy, is to live long enough to go to a 3-day symposium all about Spirited Away all the time, because it's just so amazing. The characters are wonderful, and the story is amazing, and the animation is just extraordinary. It really is another world.
Have you been to the Ghibli Museum in Japan?
Yes, several times. It's lovely. It's sort of what you might expect. It's small. It's It's cute. It's very kind of wooden, not plasticky, no thrill rise, no nothing. And it's very charming. It is very hard to get into because it's so small. But it's very child oriented, and I like its simplicity and its lack of pretense. It's a definitely one should go when it has a chance.
Have you been to Anime Boston?
I have, yes, and enjoyed it very much. Excuse me, I'm getting a sneeze coming along.
Oh,
Nope, I think I'm okay.
we'll wait
Yes,
for you.
I enjoyed it. I love the cosplay in particular, but I enjoy the panels too.
Hmm. When did manga start in Japan?
Well, there are some people say it started in the 19th century with a man named Hokusai, who did something called manga. Hokusai is one of the great Japanese artists. And he did incredible sketches of real people, of fish, of birds and beasts, of sort of strange things going on, but he didn't tell stories with them. And really, manga, as we know it, kind of came about in the 20th century and was heavily influenced by American comics and by European comics too. And really were popular from the 1920s and 30s on, and then kind of had a big comeback after the war because they were really cheap to produce.
Hmm.
And you could also lend them to people and kind of circulate them. And so they were tremendously important. They're less important now because people just don't read as much, and they also have their cell phones. But you will have forms of manga on some cell phones too.
Hmm. What do you think is the biggest difference of female characters of Miyazaki versus Disney films?
Um, Good question. Uh, Very good question.
Hmm.
This is something I do tend to want to explore. Over the years, Disney has had a lot of princesses. I don't think anyone would disagree about that. And these princesses have tended to be passive. I mean, most literally in the form of Sleeping Beauty. You know, she just lies there asleep until she gets kissed. Doesn't have a lot of what we like to call agency. Snow White, maybe a little bit more, but she ends up lying dead or asleep and has to get kissed. Uh, Things changed a little bit with Ariel the mermaid, although her final kind of future is to get married and, you know, live happily ever after. Belle as well. I think we all loved, people of my generation loved Belle because she was a heroine who did have ideas and loved books and was interesting, but she's still not going on her own to do anything. So up until very recently, I'd say that Ghibli female characters, excuse me, Disney female characters tend to be on the passive side and not really interesting as human beings, if you want to call them human beings. I do know that Ariel is a mermaid. But as I said, I was very struck by Frozen 2, which I thought was quite an awesome movie. And really had two very interesting female protagonists, especially Elsa, who is absolutely a classic hero in that she hears a call to adventure. She takes it, but she also brings in some new aspects to it. She brings her family and her friends, and yet she is very much kind of trying to be in charge of her destiny. Again, I don't want to give too much away if you haven't seen it, but there are just some incredible moments when she is literally wrestling with her destiny in the form of a river horse that is just incredible. I was blown away by that film. So I think that I'm betting that Disney has gotten a bit of influence from Miyazaki in particular.
Hmm. Okay, and we're just about out of time. I just do want to ask this one last question because you had mentioned Miyazaki's son sort of taking over Ghibli and doing his, continuing on sort of the tradition. But Will asks, have you seen other artists that are perhaps inspired by the Miyazaki world building style and are taking up the mantle for morally complicated and artfully created animation?
Lovely, lovely question. Um, Kind of. As I said, Hosoda, Wolf Children, is a beautiful film about this woman, a human woman who marries a wolf man, I guess, and has two children who change back and forth between wolves and humans. And it's a lovely, very affecting film, but it does bring up some interesting issues because it says these children are biracial. We could see as a metaphor. And in Japan right now, there's still a lot of enormous amount of reluctance to let in immigration, but things are happening. And so one could see the film as having moral subtleties that you can enjoy it for just what it is, which is true of Miyazaki's films too. So that's one thing that I find very interesting. Shinkai, your name is it morally complex? Sorry, I just finished writing an article on this, so I don't want to bore people to death. It certainly is dealing with some very heavy duty issues. Namely, I think it was made in 2016 in the wake of the terrible 3/11 disaster, the tsunami and the Fukushima meltdown of the nuclear plant, and also the earthquake. And so it is dealing with sort of resilience. Which is very much a Miyazaki theme as well.
Mm-hmm. I guess I wanted to ask that particular question. Thank you, Will, because you are a professor here at Tufts, and so I thought too. Have you seen students? I mean, there's obviously a great love for Miyazaki's work that you think like could carry on the mantle in this country.
Oh, wouldn't that be great? I believe it's perfectly possible. In fact, maybe, more possible. I mean, the trouble with, we could go into this a lot. Anime in Japan is very focused these days on particular kinds of anime and appealing to a particular kind of audiences. I think that in America, we are potentially more free. And, the one problem is that it's not well paid and it's an awful lot of work. So, you have to really believe in it. But, and I would say if I were going to recommend to anyone, I would say go back and read some really good literature. Don't spend your time playing video games. Sorry, because there's some brilliant video games out there, and I'm kind of fascinated by them too. But the kind of three-dimensional characters and really interesting things that go on in a Miyazaki film, I think really come from literature. So go back to your libraries and read a lot of books.
Oh, that is the perfect way to end this, this program. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. And thank you all for coming. It was very kind of you.
Yes, wonderful, wonderful questions, very thoughtful and amazing answers. I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm going to go. I've watched some Miyazaki films, but I feel like I need to catch them all now.
Oh, please do. Definitely.
So I do want to remind people that you can buy signed and personalized books from Susan, any of her books, including Miyazakiworld, through Bank Square Books. I did put the link in the chat, and I will put it in the recap as well. And just thank you, Susan. This has been amazing.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. All right. Good night, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Good night. Bye-bye.